Welcome to Chess with Link. Today we're looking at the Caro-Kann Defense. Now specifically, we're going to follow the path of the classical variation up through a particular point, and then we'll take a little bit of a side path. The Caro-Kann begins, as so many chess games do, with white moving a pawn to e4. For a king's pawn opening, we would mirror that move, making sure that white can't press forward anymore. Or for a Sicilian game, we would bring our pawn forward to c5, making sure that we are threatening the center of the board without actually putting our own pieces at risk and making sure that we have a little pressure forward. The Caro-Kann does something a little bit different. We're going to push our c-pawn forward, but only one square. Now, why would we do that? Well, at a beginner level, we'll probably notice that it lets our queen out, but be careful about that. Remember, you don't usually want to bring out your queen for at least the first 7 to 10 turns. We're planning ahead. We know that our opponent is going to be trying to gain control of the center and that they are unlikely to bring out their queen. So we're limiting the bishop options a little bit. And more importantly, we are supporting a future attack towards the middle. White will probably bring their pawn forward to d4, and now they have a lot of pressure. They are standing in 2 of the center squares, and they are pressuring on 4 of those center squares across into our territory. But we have planned for this. We're going to take our pawn up to d5. Now, at this point, we have gained control of a center square, and we are defending that pawn. So it's unlikely that our opponent will capture our d-pawn on their turn, especially because that would open up an easy path towards their king in the future. You usually don't want your king to get too exposed, especially not early in the game. So the common response is going to be knight to c3. That defends the e4 pawn and puts a little bit of pressure on our d5 pawn, even though we know that it's defended twice over by both our pawn and our queen. So it's very unlikely that our opponent will capture. But we just talked about how dangerous it is to lose defenses in the king's file. So we're going to go ahead and take advantage of that and capture on e4. Our pawn can't actually hit the king, but it's rather inconvenient if we push that pawn forward more, either drawing out the f2 pawn or putting pressure on the pieces around the king, including, of course, the queen. So white will probably respond by capturing our pawn, especially because that allows their knight to now threaten pretty deep into our territory. But do you notice that that knight isn't defended by anything? That's where we get to our next move. Let's bring our bishop to f5. Now, I want to remind you, if you have trouble with all of the chess notation, try to think about this visually. Think about it as pieces that are being pressured and pieces that are being defended. And we now have an undefended knight being pressured by an undefended bishop. So our opponent probably wants to either move or defend their knight. And in this path, they move the knight. Specifically, they move that knight to a spot where it pressures back onto our bishop. We've gained a little bit of tempo here. We've got our opponent to make a reactive move. But now we have to basically do the same thing. So let's take our bishop back to g6, which honestly does not change terribly much about the pressure patterns on the board, because we are still threatening through that c2 pawn all the way over to b1, which includes pressure here on e4, which we have cleared out by capturing with our pawn. And so their king is now exposed. We don't have an easy way of pressuring the king yet, but we've gained a little bit of control of the center. From here, we also encourage our opponent to make a little bit of an awkward move. Remember, moving pawns near the edge of the board is usually not a great choice, especially not at the beginning of the game. We don't want to move our rook, and we really don't even want to move knights in the G file. So what's that h4 pawn doing? Take a look at the bishops. Remember that just as we brought our bishop out pretty early, our opponent is probably thinking about getting their bishop to g5, which doesn't have an immediate attack, but it could cause us to make a little bit of an awkward pawn move here at f7, and it prevents us entirely from pushing our king's pawn, because otherwise that bishop would be able to hit our queen. And that's why our next step here in the classical Caro-Kann is to push our pawn forward. It's a little more subtle. And notice that we're not pushing all the way forward to h5, because even though we are defending that square against the knight, the queen would be able to jump in. And that queen would be threatened by our rook. But we don't want to allow that potential. We don't want to allow the opportunity for our opponent to pressure like that. We want to defend our territory, not give our opponent invitations. And by moving to h6, we're now pressuring on g5, making it unlikely that the bishop will move forward. So what's our opponent going to do? Well, they have moved a couple of pawns, they've moved a knight, they're thinking of moving the bishop, but it's not the greatest path right now. So they're probably going to bring out their knight. That knight allows them to defend their h4 pawn without even thinking of bringing the rook out too early. It also starts to clear a little bit of a path towards castling, and it pressures into the middle of the board, including defending the d4 pawn. Pressure and defense, especially in the middle, or squares that could hit the middle, are fundamental to early moves in chess. All right, how do we react to that then? Well, let's go ahead and bring our knight to d7. We could bring out our f6 knight, but that could make things a little bit awkward, like we were talking about earlier. By moving to d7, we are now threatening two squares near the middle, and we have the potential to move that knight to block attacks that come in from the bishop if it ever gets to g5. We could jump that knight over to f6, and it would be guarded by both two pawns and a knight. All right. What's going to happen now? In your pure classical variation, we would likely see our opponent move f1 to d3, putting a little back and forth pressure between our bishops. The thing is that that's very expected. It's very obvious. So, there's a variation named after historic chess player Spassky. White in high-level play will often push their pawn to h5. That puts a pawn across the center of the board, a pawn that is defended by a knight and a rook, and pressuring our bishop. But we don't need to worry too much yet, because just like we moved that bishop back once, but still had pressure diagonally through the center and into our opponent's territory, we can pull our bishop back to h7. Why would this variation be popular these days? Why does Spassky start playing this variation? Well, it's because that bishop trade is basically inevitable. White wants to get that bishop off the board, or get us to move the bishop to an even worse spot. And it's always good to have the ability to castle. Now, castling towards a side that the pawn has moved on does mean that the king is not quite as safe from castling, but you usually end up pushing either the g or the h pawn a couple of squares after you castle to give the king an escape route. So in this case, moving the bishop out pressures us into the trade while also opening up future attack paths. And it's at this point that we should go ahead and take the trade. Whether we're playing the Spassky Variation or classic Caro-Kann, the bishop getting traded and luring the queen out right here at the edge of when we want to see a queen activated is a solid move. And for the final move in our sequence today, we're going to push our e6 pawn forward. I mentioned that a while ago. We talked about the potential to move bishops. We talked about how first we had one bishop that had a lot of movement potential, and now we have another, and because we didn't go full Sicilian up to c5, we now have a bishop that can zip all the way up here. And while going for a rapid check at b4 is usually not the answer, especially because they could try and kick us with their pawn or oppose us with their bishop, it still gives us the chance to gain some tempo or compel a move. Now we're going to pause at this point, because first of all, I have left aside dozens of side paths. But I'd like you to look at this board and think to yourself, if you were playing white, do you like the amount of pressure that you have at the center of the board? Do you like that you could castle or move your h1 rook forward to the awkward spot of h4? Do you like that you could shift that queen into the e-file to protect your king and potentially limit our use of the e6 pawn or more forward squares in the e-file? And if you're playing as black, do you like that you could have a rapid check? Do you like that your queen could also participate in a check? How about that you can bring your knight forward to e7 and then have it either block the d-file pawn from moving forward more, or move to f5 defended by a pawn as long as the queen doesn't pin it, and oppose our opponent's knights? It's a solid opening. It's an opening that gives us a lot of potential attacks. And because it's not played as frequently as a king's pawn opening or a Sicilian opening, you do have the potential to put your opponent on their back foot a little bit. And ultimately, that's a lot of what chess comes down to, is whether you feel comfortable in your position and can see forward 3 or 4 or maybe 5 moves, or if you are feeling tangled. There's a bunch of variations on the Caro-Kann, and we'll cover some more later. Please, if you're in one of my OutSchool classes, post a message in the classroom or send me a message on OutSchool. If you are following along on YouTube, please leave a kind comment down below, a nice question, a position that you have a question about. And I'm happy to include a reply to that in a future video about variations on the Caro-Kann, just as we broke away from the classical path at move 8 to follow the Spassky Variation, because it feels inevitable to me. Remember that chess is about planning ahead, controlling territory, and defending your own pieces, as well as putting your opponent in awkward situations they're not sure about. And while it can be challenging to memorize sequences of moves, I find that if we look at openings, and especially look at how they shift control of the board somewhere around turn 5 to 10, that can go a long way to helping us build a series of attacks and defenses that we're comfortable with, that we're familiar with, so that we know how to respond when our opponent makes a move that we're not familiar with, because we're already confident in our plan moving forward. Or we can see the territory of the board, and even if we're a little uncertain, we can plan how to leave possible moves for our knights and bishops and queen, and that will let us get back to a position we're comfortable with. Have a great week, folks.